2024 was awful for the games industry, and it's hard to reflect on the year without acknowledging the fact that over 15,000 people were laid off or otherwise terminated from their positions in the last 12 months alone. And that's a lot of talent going to waste, a record-breaking amount even, beating the previous record holder, 2023. It's been a rough couple of years for the industry, and in times like this, it's easy to get doomer-brained about the future and stress yourself out real fast, but 2024 is over. So let's take a second, breathe, and ring in the new year with old games. Because even though there were a lot of issues going on behind the scenes, 2024 was a big year for gaming. Despite starting off on the slower side, there were a lot of noteworthy titles dropped last year, so much so that it gave way to one of the fiercest Game of the Year debates that I've seen online in quite some time. And in a year with so many big releases, it just begs the question, which ones were the best? But as always, before we get to the big boys, my top 10, I want to open by talking about some of the items I crossed off my backlog. And this year, I want to start off with a game that I have seen nobody talk about since its release. Sackboy: A Big Adventure is fantastic. This 3D platformer has gone mostly unmentioned in online spaces since its release as a PS5 launch title, but booting it up with a couple friends, I found one of the most charming little experiences available on the market. I love a good platformer, and this, despite not quite reaching the heights of the little guy's past adventures, is a pretty dang good one, and it's all framed using this handcrafted art style that I just adore. A lot of games have been doing this recently, and it puts a big stupid smile on my face every time. Look, they have the UI being held up by fishing wire. Isn't that just the most adorable shit you've ever seen? Sackboy throws a lot at the wall, but that doesn't stop it from being a nice, digestible experience. People use the word cozy a lot to describe games nowadays, and most of the time that means a farming simulator with townies to learn about and a generally warm cottagecore aesthetic, but to me, this is more my kind of cozy. A comfortable mid-scale 3D platformer that could feasibly be beaten in a couple days. A lot of people have beef with this one for removing Sackboy from his signature LittleBigPlanet and thus possibly dooming that series' future, and trust me, I get it, this one would have been better with Stephen Fry narration, but if you choose to look at this game as more of a spin-off than a direct sequel to some of PlayStation's best and most okay, you'll probably enjoy yourself. In 2024, one of my favorites from last year, Mortal Kombat 1 got a new DLC expansion titled Khaos Reigns, and while the fandom has been fairly divided on this new era of Mortal Kombat, I really love this direction they've been taking the series. I just kinda hate the way the story's been handled. Mortal Kombat 1 rebooted the series with a new timeline, and throughout the first couple acts of the game's story mode, I liked seeing these new takes on a universe that I'd become so ingrained in. But then randomly in the third act, they pivot completely and reveal that the game is actually a multiverse plot. And every character from Mortal Kombat past is a god of their own realm. A twist that I didn't really need, and Khaos Reigns, despite piggybacking off of a story thread that I really didn't feel the need to pull on, is another installment in this series that I adore, and a not bad one at that. NetherRealm Studios has their fighting game story modes down to a science. Playing through one of these feels like watching an amazing movie where every 4 minutes everyone pauses to let you get some gaming in. These are always such a joy to play. And outside of the story, we have 6 new roster additions to take online. Some of these character choices are definitely pretty weird, going half and half with new interpretations of Mortal Kombat mainstays and characters that your dad, or maybe even your dad's dad, would be more excited to play is definitely a choice, even more so when you take into consideration that the first round of guests were all from pretty popular contemporary series, but they play nice enough in motion that I don't mind. Ghostface in particular, I find painfully silly. I'm not a fan of the Scream movies, but it's hard to deny that this moveset is inspired. Watching this guy bumble around Mortal Kombat, using the mask gimmick to deliver some excellent deep-cut fan service, his fourth wall-breaking fatality, it's goofy in all the right ways. If the rumors about this being the last piece of content to come to Mortal Kombat 1 end up being true, then I think we have a pretty solid final product here. It's not NetherRealm's best offering, that honor still goes to MKX or Injustice 2 for me, but realistically they're gonna be back with Mortal Kombat 2 in like a year and a half, so what's the point in wallowing? I know you guys want Jade, I want Jade too, but Mortal Kombat is like the only profitable game that Warner Bros. Has. They're gonna be making these until the sun blows up. We'll get our time. And from one set of DLC to another, Vampire Survivors got 3 new expansions this year, and having fallen in love with the horde-clearing dopamine fest, I was over the moon to fall back into the madness. Even more so when it was revealed that those expansions were going to be tie-ins with other established game series, meaning we got Vampire Survivors takes on Among Us, Contra, and Castlevania. I'm not the biggest fan of Castlevania or Contra, but it's clear that the devs are. The love shown to these franchises is palpable. Just look at how many icons on the character select screen are relegated to these crossover characters. They got everyone here, and all their classic weapons too. The translation of mechanics from these other games applied to the Vampire Survivors formula is genius. I'm a particularly big fan of how they managed to implement Among Us. It feels like it would be very difficult to represent everything that game has to offer in this setting, but they nail it, and it's really fun. And the Castlevania DLC elevates the content so much that at times it doesn't even feel like the same game. I don't want to spoil it, but there's some pretty cool shit that happens here. Vampire Survivors is an addiction. The gameplay loop of endlessly eviscerating enemies is just as satisfying on hour 1 as it is on hour 100, and it looks like there are no plans of slowing down content anytime soon. I anxiously await the next expansion. And speaking of that next expansion, it would be really nice if it was that Baldur's Gate 3 one that was teased a while ago. The only thing that would make this game better is my girl Shart, so hop on it. Throughout 2024, I was in a bit of a Marvel phase, with stuff like Deadpool and Wolverine, X-Men 97, Marvel vs. Capcom finally returning to the limelight, and the beta for a game that we'll talk about in a bit that wouldn't fully launch till much later in the year, and looking for something in the gaming world to scratch that Marvel itch, I remembered I still had a whole host of things to do in Marvel's Ultimate Alliance 3. Ultimate Alliance is a household name for us Marvel fans, with the first 2 being some of the most widely regarded Marvel games in history. And while the third forgoes a lot of the RPG elements to make what feels like a higher fidelity version of those old arcade beat-em-ups, I think it might be my favorite in the series. Mainly because of the roster. Throughout most of the 2010s, characters like the Fantastic Four, the Spider-Verse, and the X-Men were off limits in most wider Marvel projects because the MCU couldn't use them, and this was the first release in a while to break that curse. You know how good it feels to see a roster with a little something for everybody? They got the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, the Guardians, all of the biggest Spider-Men, a lot of the more popular street-level guys, characters to represent the more abstract stuff, and they even have representation from the Inhumans. Granted, their chunk of the game is the worst part, but if the worst part of your Marvel game is the Inhuman stuff, then that's absolutely a win. A lot of this game's content is, by design, fairly repetitive. The DLC missions in particular feature a lot of doing the same thing in the same restructured story mode assets, but it's the kind of mindless that I can get behind. I know it's pretty reductive to say that a game is only enjoyable if you can turn your brain off, but as an easily distracted zoomer who is always macrodosing on content, this is the perfect second screen grind. It's a glorified button masher with a Marvel skin, but it's my kind of game. The only problem is that the loading screens are too damn long. This is one of those games that I hope gets a Switch 2 upgrade because man, it could really benefit from it. Also, this game is still a Switch exclusive all these years later. Isn't that weird? Speaking of games that look bad on the Nintendo Switch, last year I talked about One Piece Pirate Warriors 4, a Musou title adapting the wide world of One Piece into a shockingly addictive hack-and-slash nightmare that I 100%ed without much issue. And this year, I bought another copy for PC to do it all again, marking this as the 3rd year in a row that I will have talked about this game during my Game of the Year video. This game is something unhealthy for me at this point. It's not that good, but I love playing it so much. See, I initially picked up the game for PS4, but around halfway through, I realized I wasn't completing it in the most efficient fashion. So I picked up another copy for Switch so I could play it on the go and take advantage of prior knowledge to get the best skills early on and all that jazz. But then more DLC came out, and the DLC adds a whole host of stuff like extra skills, but not a lot of content to use those skills in if you already have 100%. And around the same time, I decided it might be fun to make a video on the game, but I realized while capturing gameplay footage that the Switch version is pretty bad. Like, it looks fine when you're playing, but blowing it up to full screen like this shows off how rough around the edges it truly is. So I decided that I was going to take the plunge once again, using my expert knowledge, DLC installed from day one, experiencing everything this game has to offer. And at this rate, I have no idea if anything will actually materialize on my channel from this endeavor, but any excuse to keep playing the stupid game I love so much long after I've dried up the wells of its content is fine by me. Anyone who's ever played a Warriors title can tell you how well this gameplay loop can work. Small-scale, overwhelming destruction, large-scale strategy, and every mission giving you more resources to upgrade your characters who then get brought in for that overwhelming destruction. rinse and repeat. It's a feedback loop that I've been addicted to for years now, combining the mindless fun of a Warriors game with One Piece, which I'll take any excuse to talk about. And I think it's officially been long enough that we can start speculating about a potential Pirate Warriors 5. And if that's the case, please make Sulong Carrot into a full transformation this go around and not just a 3-second attack. That is, if she even makes it to the next game. Second request, please don't cut Carrot. Pivoting to something that actually released in 2024, I'm still not 100% sure we needed a Hades 2, but boy am I glad we got it. Hades was as close to perfect as I think any video game could be, so it should be no surprise to find out that its sequel, featuring Melanoi, the secret second child of Hades taking on the Titan Kronos, quickly became another favorite of mine. Hades 2 takes the fast-paced, room-based roguelike action of the first and slows it down a little. Where you could easily get away with spam dodging in Hades Prime, the second makes sure you are acutely aware of the buttons you're pressing and punishes you if you're not. And while a part of me selfishly wanted this game to control the exact same as the first as to not offset the delicate balance that made the original so playable, I can respect that Hades 2's gameplay is all its own. Melanoi and Zagreus are very different characters with very different relationships to the gods. It's only natural that they fight in different ways. Everything you liked about Hades is back in full force. The game still boasts that wonderful painted art style, the new characters are just as charming as the ones from the past, and character renders for those making reappearances are updated to feature them donning wartime outfits. But enough is different that it doesn't feel like a complete retread. And the best part is, this is just the beginning. As the game is currently in early access, there is still more content to come and everything is subject to change, but as it is, Hades 2 is a worthwhile continuation to one of the best games from the past couple years. Once this thing exits early access, it's for sure going to be in the top 10. Speaking of, let's get to the big boys. Stellar Blade is Nier Automata if it was 10% less good and 80% more horny. And I really liked it. Yes, the game that seems to only exist so gooners on the internet can post clips of the protagonist in sexy outfits is a shockingly solid experience. I am no stranger to flashy action games with not over-sexualized protagonists, but Stellar Blade brings it to a point of, I mean, just look at this. Can I even show this? This is crazy. And she looks like this the entire time. I'm far from a prude when it comes to stuff like this, but like, Jesus, is this even arousing anymore? There's been a lot of talk about this game and how much of this is acceptable, and I don't know if me and my man brain can give an especially nuanced or particularly valuable take on that conversation, but what I will say is that this game makes stuff like Bayonetta look classy and reserved. And the fact that that's even possible is a testament to Stellar Blade's unfiltered hypersexuality. Make of that what you will. We don't get games like this very often anymore, with most mainstream action titles nowadays being hapless attempts to recreate what made Dark Souls popular, but I find Stellar Blade interesting for the fact that it provides an almost exact middle ground between that and your more traditional character action game. Like the FromSoft classics, combos are simple, most just requiring 1 or 2 button presses before cycling into a new attack, healing items are sparse and refreshed at enemy respawning camps, and set enemies are slow, hit like a truck, and require careful timing to work around. Yet everything still manages to feel fast-paced and interesting, something that, in the past, hasn't always held true in my experience with other Souls-likes. It doesn't fully commit to the insane, over-the-top, tongue-in-cheek antics that you would expect from something like the aforementioned Bayonetta, which is a bit of a bummer given how it otherwise feels like such a spiritual successor to that series, but it delivers its own spin on action combat. And while in motion, it doesn't look exceedingly interesting, which is part of the reason why I imagine most fans of this game online just post clips in photo mode, it plays nicely in your hands. This is one of those games where I completely understand the reputation it's garnered online. Looking at clips of this game paints a very particular picture about the final product, and that picture isn't inaccurate. But if you're confident enough in your ability to explain away the game's content matter to someone unlucky enough to walk in while you're playing it, I bet you'll have a good time. Sonic X Shadow Generations made Sonic the Hedgehog cringe again, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Also, its naming scheme is very clearly made to fuck with people trying to Google Sonic X Shadow, and I find that hilarious. As a longtime fan of the Sonic the Hedgehog series, something I've picked up on with later releases and adaptations is how scared Sega seems to be of the franchise's edgier past. Sonic has always been 50% fun adventures with rad animal characters and 50% self-serious melodrama caused by world-ending catastrophe, but that second part felt like it had been all but erased throughout most of the 2010s. Sonic plots more closely resembled those of a Saturday morning cartoon, most characters fell into a flanderized version of themselves, and any attempts at wider character development were mocked as Sonic Team began to embrace its role as gaming's punching bag. Sonic's entire presence online for years was just, look at how bad and stupid we are. But all of that came to a screeching halt with the release of a game called Sonic Frontiers. Sonic Team's first attempt at a new gameplay style in over a decade, and one of the most deliciously dramatic Sonic titles at that. And if Sonic Frontiers was opening the floodgates to the series being weird again, Shadow Generations is a full-force cannonball into the edge hole, directly tackling a lot of what people thought were the most poorly conceived plotlines of the series and presenting them with a sincerity so strong that people are looking back on these titles as if they were actually good the whole time, which I assure you, they were not. Shadow Generations, in broad strokes, is a retread of Shadow the Hedgehog's history, directly taking you to levels recreating pivotal moments for the Hedgehog, and some levels that weren't, giving more screen time to characters who only existed in flashbacks, and some who didn't, and giving Shadow access to new powers that are as nice to control as they are flashy on screen. And some that aren't. And all of this is built on the back of the already fantastic Sonic Generations, which is bar none the best boost formula Sonic game, providing equal amounts fun fan service and genuine forward movement for not just the Shadow character, but Sonic gameplay as a whole. Sonic X Shadow was the biggest surprise of 2024. What appeared at first as an uninspired re-release of a game Sega knew would sell turned out to be an uninspired re-release of a game Sega knew would sell, and 4 hours of the best the Sonic series has to offer. If you're on the periphery of being a Sonic fan because of the movies or whatever, this would be the one I tell you to check out first. Dragon Ball Sparking Zero made me nostalgic for something I didn't even realize I was missing. In a world where most anime games are just arena fighter nonsense where you play for a few hours to see all your favorite references only to put it down and never think about it again, Sparking Zero delivers on an old school premise to create what might be the best arena fighter ever made. It's crazy how every corner of Dragon Ball is represented through this game. And not only represented, but loved, celebrated even. The story mode is great with fan-servicey alternate outcomes to iconic events, the moment-to-moment gameplay plays exactly like you expect a Dragon Ball fight to look, and every character you could possibly want is playable. Well, everyone except for Super 17. Sparking Zero strikes a perfect balance of chaotic fun and a learnable skill curve. Most arena fighters are an absolute mess when you try to play them online, but this one has a pretty good amount of depth to it. It's no fighters, but it lends itself to people who want to sweat it, and I find that really cool. It's rare that you find a licensed product that's firing on all cylinders like this is, the elusive anime game that's so good that I could feasibly recommend it to someone who doesn't care about that anime because it's mechanically rich and has an insane amount of content. And all of this is before DLC, which might not sound like a lot, but Bandai Namco's Dragon Ball games have a history of living long, prosperous lives full of post-launch content. I feel like the fact that Sparking Zero even exists and it shipped out in the complete state that it did is an achievement on its own. This 17 years in the making sequel feels like it didn't miss a beat, and that's genuinely commendable. I hope that this is one of those games that continues to get DLC for years to come. We know we're getting packs based on Super Superhero and Daima, but I'd love stuff based on OG Dragon Ball, some of the GT characters that got left behind, maybe the Granola arc, A Man Can Dream, but most importantly, if this game wraps up without Chi-Chi being playable at all, I'll consider this whole franchise to be a failure. If you were to ask me if I loved Multiversus, I would tell you that it's one of the worst made games I have ever played. Unbalanced, buggy combat, a fairly active live service model that has only served to make the game worse in the long run, and all of it built atop one of the most aggressively anti-consumer foundations to be found in gaming. But do I love it? Every now and then I fall in love with a game that is, objectively, quite bad, but the difference with Multiversus is that this time around, you guys fell in love with it too. Multiversus content has been the most performant thing I've ever done on this channel, with all 4 of the post-relaunch videos landing somewhere in my YouTube top 10. And this in combination with the game's relaunch making it so I can actually play the thing again has reignited a passion for this game that feels like it's trying its best to keep me from being invested in it. Multiversus feels like Super Smash Bros. If every character was designed with the same over-the-top depth that came from Smash Ultimate's power creep. Every character on the roster has so much going on, and when it works, it's a blast. Problem being, it never fucking works. Combine that interesting, if incredibly flawed gameplay with Warner Bros. IP integration that ranges from nostalgic cartoon characters to that guy from that movie your mom likes, and you have a game that I adore playing so much that I can almost ignore everything else. Almost. Listen, it's hard to talk about this game without mentioning in the same breath that it is so unbelievably scummy that even if I enjoy it, I couldn't recommend a single living soul try it out of morbid curiosity. But I love it, and I choose to enjoy it while it's here because we all know that Multiversus is not making it to the Best Games 2025 video. Does this count as a game released in 2024, even though it's a relaunch of a previously already launched title? I don't know. But what I do know is that the only way to save this game is to add Ted Lasso. And if you disagree with me, who am I kidding? No one disagrees with me because no one else still plays this game. So in 2024, I got really mad at the Game Awards for including a DLC in the Game of the Year category. But after thinking about it for a few weeks, I am here to announce that I am a hypocrite and about to break that rule myself. Because one of the best things I played this year was in fact a DLC. But it wasn't for Elden Ring. My favorite DLC was for a little game called Splatoon. Splatoon 3 Side Order was like crack for me. I love roguelikes, and for the most part I like the moment-to-moment gameplay of Splatoon, so it should be completely unsurprising to find out that this marriage of ideas created an experience that had me so addicted that I almost forgot how unbearable I find Clam Blitz. After years of getting my teeth kicked in through ultra-difficult single-player challenges and still refusing to learn how to use motion controls in ranked lobbies, I know they make you aim better, I don't particularly care, Side Order delivers a Splatoon power fantasy that the previous entries could never rival. Between all the different weapon palettes and the numerous upgrades that are awarded to you after each floor, you can really make every Side Order run your own. And like all good roguelikes, it's fairly easy to just break the game and make it completely unintelligible. And I think that's fun. This great gameplay is enhanced by a story featuring some of my favorite characters in the series. And weirdly enough, this alongside the Grand Festival basically ties up all of the loose ends from the last 3 years of squid splatting, leaving the future of Splatoon as a franchise kinda uncertain. We all know we're getting a Splatoon 4 at some point, likely with some theming of the past, but after 3 games that were all iterating on the same base concept, it feels like whatever we're getting next is probably gonna be pretty different. And I couldn't think of a more fitting coda for this trilogy than what might be the single most out-of-the-box piece of content to grace the Splatoon series. I hope that this is a sign of things to come. So at this rate, most people who have found their way to this channel probably know me through Multiversus. But did you know that before Multiversus, the game that I would routinely check up with the most was Overwatch? I hung on to that game well into the 2020s, long after most people abandoned it. But when they went from Overwatch 1 to Overwatch 2, I decided I had had enough and quit the game. And there are many reasons as to why, but ultimately, it just wasn't the game I fell in love with anymore. So imagine my reaction when I discovered Marvel Rivals, a pretty blatant Overwatch ripoff that takes place in the wide multiverse of Marvel Comics. Needless to say, I was in love. I call Marvel Rivals a ripoff, but I mean that with love. It takes everything that worked about Overwatch, removes a lot of the shit that I hated, and smartly tweaks reused ideas to make them far less toxic in application. Seriously, I have a longer video coming about this game, and I could probably include a 10-minute segment called Things Marvel Rivals Does Better Than Overwatch. And I might! It also just looks really good. Marvel as a brand has been pretty visually stagnant in recent years, so this gorgeous video game with high-quality animation, boasting some pretty inspired redesigns of characters from all over Marvel Comics has been a delightful addition to my gaming time. And I mean all over Marvel Comics. We got Squirrel Girl in here, and as one of the 10 people who knew who she was before this game, I'm ecstatic. Marvel Rivals feels too good to be true. It plays nicely, looks good, has garnered a huge fan base that hasn't left the game behind, and it's not developed by Activision Blizzard, so I feel relatively okay about supporting it. And most importantly, it's free. It's probably too early to make any lasting judgments about this game's legacy, but as of right now, the future looks good. I hope this one manages to stay the course and not succumb to corporate greed like oh so many before it. Towards the end of 2024, I played a game called SteamWorld Heist as a low-effort clickbait attempt to clear out some of my backlog. Later that month, I would fall in love with its sequel. SteamWorld Heist 2 is yet another entry in the channel favorite SteamWorld series, putting you in the shoes of Captain Quincy Leeway and his ragtag set of misfits trying to make a name for themselves in the high seas. Everything I loved from the first game is back and amped up to an 11. The turn-based RPG gameplay is simple, easy to pick up and play, but manages to offer a lot of depth as you get deeper into the experience. The manual aiming allows you to pull off some pretty incredible shots if you're patient, and this is easily the SteamWorld game with the biggest scope yet. This overworld is huge. But despite the game's ambitious scale, I found it easier to slow down and cite the small things that make this world for me. This is easily the most gorgeous one of these things has ever been. The watercolor steampunk sci-fi backdrop behind every battle, in combination with the way the lighting in the environments played with the 2D sprites in the foreground, is an improvement on an art style that I never thought was lacking, and everything feels elevated this way. The characters are written better, there's even more classes and tools at your disposal, you can multi-class characters now, which is great for customization but almost choice paralyzing for me, and the music, done by a band that routinely tops my Spotify Wrapped, is better than it has ever been. A Life of Undelightment is an all-time steam-powered giraffe song. And because I know that out of everything on this list, you're most likely to have never heard of this one before now, if anything here catches your eye, I implore you to check it out. I have never been disappointed by a SteamWorld game. I've never seen another studio with such a diverse yet consistently stellar lineup. This one is worth your time. Balatro is a game I feel like I don't need to explain the high placement of. There are two types of people on this earth, those who have played Balatro and get it, and those who haven't and don't know how to sleep with themselves at night. And me? I sleep great. Or at least I did before Balatro. Balatro is about making poker hands. Each hand is worth a certain value of chips, and you do this to try and get a big number, and then you get modifier joker cards to help you get even bigger numbers, and it all comes together to form a gameplay loop of just watching numbers go up over and over again. And it's simple, but it's effective. It's so easy to lose yourself in the barrage of colors and numbers. Many of my Balatro sessions ended with me jaw agape, head empty, looking like Golden Freddy on the couch. It nails that feel of small short dopamine hits that keep you playing for hours longer than you intended. I think the biggest sign of Balatro's quality is just how much it's taken the world by storm. I don't go a single day without seeing someone play Balatro. Everyone always talks about it on social media, my Discord friends tab always has someone with it open, and every family gathering I've been to in the last 3 months for the holidays has had someone on their phone playing Balatro the whole time. Balatro is more than just a game, it's a movement, and all of it was apparently made by just one guy. One guy who owes me a lot of my time back. I almost don't recommend it. I miss the person I was before I knew this game existed, who still had a healthy work-life balance, so all I'll say is, gamble responsibly, folks. Astrobot is a game so good that it made people remember how good PlayStation used to be before the PS5 and its infamous lack of games, and its lack of infamous games, tainted the company's reputation. And despite going into this experience skeptical as all hell from what can only be described as an avalanche of critical praise this game had received, having now played it, I get it. The best way I can describe Astrobot to someone new is that it's basically Super Mario Galaxy if it was made by PlayStation. An inventive as hell 3D platformer with every level boasting new gimmicks for you to play around with, nothing ever hanging around long enough for it to get stale. And it does all of this while endlessly reminding you what console you're playing it on. Calling Astrobot PlayStation propaganda is like calling Super Smash Bros. Nintendo propaganda. Like, yeah, it is, but that's only a bonus on what is already an incredibly solid title. Yeah, there's little PlayStation cameos all over the place, and every inch of this circuit board-laden world is covered in the iconic PlayStation button shapes, but Astrobot doesn't let the home field advantage define the experience. The best parts of this game are when it's blazing its own path instead of reflecting on Team Blue's past. Once every few levels, they let the mask slip and deliver you a full-on love letter to an iconic PlayStation franchise. And while these are definitely more inside baseball, I can't imagine anyone who isn't amazingly familiar with the Uncharted series will think that this is one of the game's better levels, an unfortunately unavoidable problem because I know nobody's actually played Horizon. They're so masterfully crafted that it still ends up charming. It's very Nintendo in the way that it prioritizes the fun of the moment-to-moment gameplay and builds everything else around that. There's a reason Nintendo games still sell despite the fact that they're landlocked to weaker hardware, and there's a lesson there that I think PlayStation specifically could really benefit from learning. People are mad about this one, saying how it's dumb that this could be Game of the Year over one of the many large-scale action RPGs that also released in 2024, but I think it's a good reminder of how a game doesn't need super flashy graphics or years worth of content to be considered worthwhile. Plus, it's nice to see PlayStation finally have a new mascot that isn't just another real-life human human. If nothing else, this game was incredibly effective at making me fall in love with this little guy. So much so that I want them to make real-life blind boxes based off the ones in the game. Astrobot may be a commercial, but it's a good commercial, so I can't complain. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth might be the best game ever made. I didn't like Final Fantasy VII Remake. I thought it was slow, needlessly tedious, awkwardly acted, and thought that the meager attempt to stretch out what is essentially a tutorial in the original to a full game in order to make an episodic trilogy out of the remakes was a bad idea. And then I played this and realized that that was just getting all the stupid and boring stuff out of the way for the real game. Rebirth is insane. It feels like every new area has an entire full game's worth of content, and I cannot understate how effective it was to take all of the good parts of Remake out of the dreary gray nightmare that was Midgar. So much of what didn't work in the first game has to do entirely with its setting. It turns out, annoyingly verbose NPCs and side quests that don't amount to much are far more charming when experienced in the context of a more whimsical cross-country adventure. Helping out the citizens of Midgar felt incredibly inappropriate within the urgent context of the first title, but in the aimlessness of this more open world, it feels great. And I use the word aimless in the nicest way possible. Each and every time the game opened up into a large area and said have at it, I was kicking my feet, twirling my hair, and giggling. A lot of people said that this made the game overwhelming for them, like it was too much, and while I see their point, I have to disagree. I love me a game that has some good open world bullshit to complete, you know what I mean? Climbable towers, collectible items, outposts, or some other form of combat gauntlet. A good game has a lot of content for you to tackle in its open world, but only a great game can make the 50th combat challenge feel as good as the first, and this was one of those for me. Rebirth isn't the kind of game with any subtlety in its storytelling. If you get a flashback, it's at least an hour long, features multiple combat sections, and hammers into you the message of the flashback repeatedly, but the world is finally matching the energy of these loud personalities. It's so sincere in its goofiness, and that makes it a lot easier to ignore some of the story's obvious shortcomings. And this is all coming from someone who hasn't even played Final Fantasy VII. I decided a while ago that I was just gonna ride out the remakes as my first go with this game, and I'm learning now that that was definitely not the intended experience, but I don't know, it's working. I'm having a great time. This team just gets it. Flashy combat, gorgeous graphics that are consistent throughout the entire experience, a wonderful set of characters that I'm genuinely invested in, and some of the greatest minigames to grace the genre. I'll never get tired of Fort Condor. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is my 2024 Game of the Year. See ya!